Hello, good evening. This is St. Peter's in Hove, and I'm Father Alexander, and welcome to our 133rd step in our walking tour through the Bible. And lo and behold, we meet an obstacle, because that obstacle is that titan of biblical literature, the book of Job. And I have to say that I find reading the book of Job a titanic struggle. And so my confession is, first of all, I don't particularly like the book of Job. And the second thing I have to say is a lot of people whose judgment I respect adore the book of Job and think it is the greatest work of literature in the Bible, and indeed the greatest work of literature in the world. One such, for example, is Sally Vickers, the novelist. She is very keen on the book of Job, and she's actually written a novel about the book of Job, which I recommend to you. I think it's her second or her third novel. All her novels, incidentally, are simply wonderful. So do read Sally Vickers if you're not sure about what you should read. Her first novel, Miss Garnet's Angel, is simply superb work. Now, to get back to the book of Job, why don't I like it? Well, okay, let's have a look at the book of Job. It starts off as a folk tale. Job has all these daughters and all these sons and so on, and they're all wiped out. And then Job loses his fortune and he loses his health and so on. And he sits down in the ash heap, scraping himself with that bit of pottery. And three friends turn up to comfort him, the comforters of Job. Then, right at the end, the other bookend of the story, except it's not actually a story, as I'll try and explain in a moment. The other bookend is God restores Job's fortunes, which is very trite, very pat, and quite clearly these two bookends are maybe they existed before the central bit. They're not really very important. The central bit, which is the vast majority of it, is very important. It's a series of poems. You have Job's lament about how ghastly his life is. Then you have a series of poems by each of the three friends and Job's replies. Then later on, you get another person who turns up rather unexpectedly, whose poetry has probably been inserted into the original structure, and he also has quite a lot to say. And then eventually, who knows, God turns up and gives his answer. Now, we Westerners living now, we are used to stories that don't just end but conclude. That somehow or another, at the ending of the story, we know more than we knew at the beginning of the story. Now, if you think about most works of literature, that's absolutely true. If you think about the Gospels, that's absolutely true. St. Mark's Gospel starts off with Jesus preaching and teaching, and it ends with Jesus rising from the tomb. We know much more about Jesus at the end than we do at the beginning. Indeed, the ending reveals the beginning. We suddenly understand the beginning in the light of the ending. The book of Job is not like this in the least. The book of Job goes round in circles. It tells us what we know again and again and again. Now, first of all, the first thing the book of Job tells us in Job's more or less first speech is that life is awful, life is depressing, and really it would be better for most of us if we'd never been born. And so Job has these wonderful phrases, these beautiful and evocative phrases about life is weariness and toil. Would that I had died and been buried like an unnamed child. So, for example, we have these phrases here in the third chapter where he says, "Why was I not stillborn? Or why did I not perish as I left the womb? Why were there knees to receive me, breasts for me to suck? Now I should be lying in peace, wrapped in restful slumber with the kings and high viziers of the earth, who built their dwellings in desolate places, or with the princes who have quantities of gold and silvers crammed in their tombs, or put away like an abortive child. I should not have existed, like the little ones that never see the light." In other words, existence is pain. Existentially, this is a wonderfully beautiful, which is interesting that it's beautiful, expression of what it is to be depressed, what it is to be miserable, unhappy, but more than miserable and unhappy, but to hate existence itself. If only I had, not that he wishes he's dead, he wishes he'd never existed. And, you know, May that day be darkness. May God on high have no thought for it. May no light shine on it, talking about the day of his birth. And so he's not happy. Now, if you go forward to, clearly he's not happy, but if you go for it, actually say he's not happy is just banal. This is deep, deep existential despair. Interesting that this is 2,000 years old. The book of Job is probably written 500 BC, 2,500 years old. Very sophisticated expression of existential despair. Existential despair is not something that just happened in the 20th century. It's not something that just crept up on us because of the horrors of the Second World War. But then you go to chapter 9, now that the friends have said, oh, you're complaining that you've been mistreated, but God can't mistreat people because God is just. You must have done something wrong. God cannot possibly have sentenced you to this terrible punishment without you having done something wrong. Or your incredible punishment is just a passing thing. And indeed, Job agrees. He says, this is chapter 9, indeed, I know it is as you say. How can anyone claim to be upright before God? So if Job is saying, I'm a just man and I've been terribly punished and this is wrong, well, nobody can stand in front of God and say, I am just. Anyone trying to argue matters with him could not give him one answer in 1,000. Among the wisest and the hardiest, who then can successfully defy him? He moves the mountains, though they do not know it. He throws them down when he is angry. He shakes the earth and moves it from its place, making all its pillars tremble. He's the guy who does the earthquakes. The sun at his command forbears to rise, and on the stars he sets a seal. He and no other stretched out the heavens and trampled on the back of the sea. And so it goes on. He says, verse 14, and here am I proposing to defend myself and select my arguments against him. Even if I am upright, what point is there in answering him? I can only plead for mercy with my judge. Now, do read that. What lies behind this is a utterly and totally transcendent vision of God, which we Catholics do not entirely hold with, except analogously. In other words, Job is saying, God is so great, how can I talk to God? God is so reasonable and so just, how can I reason with him? God is so just, how can I complain to God about injustice? God is so mighty, he is the one who stretched out the heavens like a tent and so on. He's the one, Lord of earthquakes and so on. How can I, a puny, tiny man, call God into question? All I can do is accept the completely transcendent, utterly wonderful decrees of God, even though I don't understand them. In fact, how could I understand them? Because God is so totally above me, because he's the supreme reason, and I'm just a puny little man with my puny human reason. Now, this is something that we Catholics don't accept, except as a sort of a poetic way of talking about the greatness of God. When we reason, we participate in the reason of God. St. Thomas Aquinas said that natural law is participatio in lex, it is participation in the supreme reason, which is to be found in God. So, in other words, if I do a mathematical problem and I work out that 2 + 2 = 4, I know something of the mind of God, which many people, Job included, would probably say that's blasphemous. Certainly, our Muslim brethren would say that's blasphemous. And certainly, I think our Greek and Russian brethren would agree with our Muslim brethren rather than with us. In other words, we Catholics believe in an immanent vision of God. God is to be found here and now. God dwells within us. God is in the world. If we look at the world, we can work out about God. The heavens proclaim the glory of God. The firmament shows forth the work of his hands. We know about the Creator because we can study his creation. Of course, somebody like Martin Luther would not agree, and most Protestants would not agree. They would say, you cannot call God into question. You cannot speak to God as man to man. And this strikes me as being not just wrong, but dangerous. Of course, we can speak to God. What is prayer except speaking to God? Now, of course, one of the things that's rather interesting about the book of Job in these endless poems, Job is not Jewish. Yeah, he comes from Eden. In fact, he comes from the south of Eden. He comes from the land of Uz, wherever that is, south of Eden. He's not Jewish. And the three comforters are not Jewish either. So in other words, Job is clearly a monotheist. Incidentally, he's a fictional character. He's a monotheist, there's no doubt about that. But he's not actually mentioning Moses or mentioning the law or mentioning the Jewish way of life. That is important because you see, the questions and the discussion that Job and his friends have, it's not a discussion that a Jewish person would have. Because a Jewish person knows that God has spoken to them through the Torah. And a Jewish person knows that in keeping the Torah, he or she is in communion with God and in dialogue with God. The whole Jewish thing in the Old Testament is dialogue with God. This is dialogue about God. And it is a God who's not revealed himself in the law. It's just God, what some people call the God of the philosophers. It's a totally transcendent vision of God. I think possibly maybe the author of the book of Job wrote the book of Job to tell us, well, to try and promote this, either to try and promote this utterly transcendent view of God, or possibly to try and show us how futile the utterly transcendent view of God is, and so that we should rejoice in the revelation of God in the law. And of course, we Christians should rejoice in the revelation of God in Jesus Christ, who spoke to men, face and women, face to face, as our equal, as another human being. It's impossible, it seems to me, to reconcile the vision of the book of Job with the vision we have of Jesus Christ. I'll talk more about this because I've already talked long enough. All the very best. Bye.